Today I'm speaking with Jasmyn. She's a very experienced marriage and family therapist. She's an individual counselor. She's a graduate of Monash in Australia, and she's been working for around 11 years. I'm very, very happy to speak with her today because we still have lots of questions around relationships that people are interested in. Thank you for speaking with me today, Jasmyn. Of
Thank you for having me, Omer.
course. All right. Jasmyn, what makes you interested in working with couples? Say a bit more about that space.
Yeah, I love working with couples primarily because I love the model of using a relational lens because I feel like the world has such a big focus on personal growth and such a limited focus on relational growth. And not to say that that can only happen through couples work. It can happen through so many different mediums and mechanisms and in families and in workspaces and in life experiences. But
Mhm.
because of our individualistic globalized culture, there's just such a minimized emphasis on a relational experience or relational growth.
Mm,
And relational growth, when I talk about our personal relational growth, it's our capacity to hold our own and relate to another and connect back. So you imagine like something circular, except that it's not just something that we learn when we're kids and then we're done. It's something that we're constantly going through in life and we're constantly needing to develop and grow. And so the reason I'm really interested in couples work is it happens to be one of the vehicles that helps us get there a bit better.
mhm. Okay. And has the space been changing in the last 10 years of your working? Have you noticed some themes that emerge or some changes that are happening in the relational space?
Yeah. Well, I've been changing,
Mm,
which is obviously there's a big difference between when I first started working from within myself and then where I am now. And I can speak a little bit about how that speaks to my work. But if I start from the very like basics, what a huge shift that's happened, I practice from Lahore in Pakistan, is that when I first started working, couples therapy was extremely taboo, and there
mm,
were a very minimal number of inquiries around couples therapy. At that time, so we're going back a decade ago, the individual therapy realm had started booming. So there was a lot happening there where there was a lot of inquiries for individual therapy. Over the years, I think shame around individual therapy has been extremely minimal.
mhm,
But even though there's been a massive spurt to where we are now with couples now seeking help in their
mm,
relationships, has been and still is more shame around saying that you are seeking relational therapy or couples work,
mm,
um, compared to, so people are much more open about coming out, be like, hey, Omar, I'm in therapy, but I would be
mm,
much more hesitant to say, hey, I'm in
mm,
couples work.
mhm,
So the shame
mhm,
around that is slightly stronger. But
okay,
yeah, definitely. One of the things that has changed
mm,
is that people have started to prioritize that the way they feel in their relationship is actually significant enough to invest in or significant enough to want to create change. I've also noticed is that there's a huge increase in numbers of people prioritizing their the quality of their marriage and their relationship, recognizing marital distress, obviously feeling hopeful
mm,
that it can be shifted, which is why they are seeking help. But
mm,
there's still a stigma around seeking help in a relationship and less so
mm.
around seeking individual therapy. So that is one of the big changes that I've noticed.
Okay. All right. I also want to touch upon abuse, especially verbal and emotional abuse, that a lot of people are wondering about that what do we do if you find yourself in that situation, whether that's an arranged marriage or whether this is of your choice, and finding a partner, finding a situation where you are stuck or you cannot exit that relationship. And how do you see that, or what themes do you notice in working with issues of abuse?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I work with a lot by
Mm,
default. Obviously, a little bit with individual work and a lot so with couples work. But I'll quickly just say, Omar, so that I can dive into this a bit better, is my idea. I've come to this conclusion when I said, okay, I've changed, the therapy scene here has changed,
mm,
and where I'm at now, but I've come to this conclusion that marriage is actually an emotionally, it's a developmental growth. Marriage is one of those vehicles that will push you in so many ways to your limits and push you to look at things that you never looked at before, woundings that you're carrying, or areas of growth. And I think the traditional success of a marriage is the longevity of it. But really, in my opinion, whether a marriage lasts or doesn't last, or the duration of it, is less significant than whether it is a healing and growth relationship.
mhm,
And sometimes healing and growth relationships can be really painful and difficult. Um, yes,
mm,
I thought I'll add that in just to add in a relational lens component, but about abuse. So we
mhm,
see abuse, it's so prevalent, um, especially because there's such a lack of awareness about what abuse is here.
mhm,
So I think what I'll say is, in my opinion, people who are struggling with abusive spouses, they're actually struggling with a spouse who is in so many ways relationally handicapped, which
mhm,
means that, I mean, when we fall in love with someone, or even if we're arranged marriage to someone and we get to know their traits and we get to know them, and it can start forming a big part of a projection, which is okay. It's like how I see Omar, you know, and the way I engage with Omar and all the great things about Omar. What I've noticed is when I struggle to see you out, and by the way, this is normal. Everyone does this. It's not just abusive clients. Most of us who enter into relationships, we enter in with some level of projection. And a lot of
mhm,
the growth work is about going beyond the projection. Abuse happens when growing beyond the projection is the difficult part. So
mhm,
if I see Omar in a certain way, and then suddenly Omar is responding in a different way, or in a way that I hadn't anticipated, or that I don't appreciate, or that I don't like, or that I struggle with, people with abusive tendencies will use those moments to lash out. And
mm,
I'm talking primarily about verbal and emotional abuse right now,
mm, mm,
which is name calling, or character assassination, or manipulating the other person's reality, making you doubt yourself,
mm,
putting you down. All of those things will happen because the abusive party is genuinely perceiving you
mm,
in some way as, for lack of a better word, as a demon.
mm,
Like, who
mm,
is this imposter who has suddenly taken over Umar, and how is he responding to me?
mm,
And it's so threatening for them. And then how do I actually respond to a demon? It's
mm,
like in the worst way imaginable. And
mm,
that's where abuse actually takes place. So
mm,
there is deep rooted psychological work that goes into an abuser recognizing what they're doing, which often, even though they might know behaviorally what they're doing is wrong, they don't recognize the emotional impact. That's how I feel in my work, and them recognizing that and then rectifying that.
mm.
And it's a very
Jasmine,
complex
if you
process.
were working with someone in your individual counseling who's coming in and reporting that their spouse is verbally abusive, but they say that well they'll never come in for couples work and then they're not going to go and speak with the therapist, how would you be working with someone who you have in your individual capacity who is going through these circumstances and saying, well, I cannot exit this relationship for some reason?
Yeah. It varies, of course. So when
Mm,
I I say this with a disclaimer that I'm not speaking to all abusive relationships right now.
mm,
So uh, a classic scenario of abuse would look like me coming to you, Omer, addressing that I'm feeling angry or upset or have an issue with something, I didn't like something, but your response not being about the issue, your
mm,
response being about my character, your
mm,
response being about you using ammunition from the past कि तुम हमेशा ऐसे करती हो, तुम्हें लड़ने का शौक है, तुम्हारी तो आदत ही ये है. Statements like that, or name calling me, or telling me that what I think is not valid, make challenging my reality. So that's what a little bit of emotional and verbal abuse looks like in
Mm,
a typical scenario. And so if a client's coming to me reporting that, the first thing I would do is getting them to recognize it, and then getting them to recognize the symptoms and work first. So the symptoms can be things like self-doubt, fear, doubting their own reality, things like, and they're clear with what they're dealing with. The intervention would look something like, Omer, that's not what I'm talking to you about.
mm,
I'm talking about the issue. So I would not get sucked into defending, attacking, counterattacking, explaining all the past events, saying,
mm,
why would you say that? I will not address any of the content that you're
mm,
using with me. I will only address the behavior, or in this case,
mm,
the communicational behavior,
mm,
where I
mm,
will say, I'm not comfortable with you referencing names. I'm not comfortable with you referencing other issues while we're referencing this issue.
mhm.
Or, so that's what a very simplistic
Okay.
initial intervention.
Yeah.
Um, and then beyond that, if I
Mm,
just take it one notch farther, the
mm,
next step would look something like, Omer,
mm,
you're making assumptions about me. So because a lot of emotional abuse and verbal abuse is actually attacking the victim's niyat, their intention.
mm,
Um, it, this is your intention. You just want to fight with me. You just did this. You always do this. You're always or their perception, attacking their intention, attacking their perception, attacking their experience. So
mm,
the next would be an intervention that says, you cannot speak from my experience. So
mhm,
if I were to go ahead and say, no, Omer, that's not my experience. What you're saying, I'm sending you the wrong message. I'm basically saying, you are allowed to define my experience, except you
mhm,
got it wrong, and here's the right one. But when we're doing an intervention, we say, it doesn't matter how you're defining my experience. It's just that you cannot define my experience. What you need
mm,
to do is you need to ask me.
mm.
You need to ask me my experience. So these would be the very initial
Okay.
interventions when we're dealing with an
Mm,
individual client who
mm.
has,
Okay.
an abusive household,
Okay.
verbal or emotional. Yeah.
Sure. Jasmine, another theme that I'm very interested in exploring with you is infidelity. A lot of people have inquired around that. I have lots of questions, but I mean, how do you first define infidelity? It's such a, especially in the digital age, it's such a complex issue. How do you see that?
Yeah, yeah. So when I first moved back here from Australia, which is where I was working at a clinic and had trained, I actually
Hmm.
had a bit of a culture shock in terms of there was so much infidelity happening.
Mm,
Even though at that time I was working with more individual clients than couples, because the demand for couples therapy was significantly lower then. And I just couldn't wrap my head around why this was, and why this was so different than the sample of clients I'd had in the West.
mhm,
And so I started to think a lot, explore, do a little bit of research, and came to just certain very basic conclusions. Is the reason that it exists is, we're not so far away from our feudal ancestors, where this was a very common phenomenon for men, where you would have the Kharvali and the Bahirwali. And the Kharvali represents, a very practical contract of marriage that we uphold for practical reasons. And the Bahirwali represents, that woman would represent, you know, erotic companionship, or emotional companionship, or playful companionship. So we already, as a culture, somewhere in our roots, we have a split
mm,
between it not being so straightforward that we can get these two things from one person. So there's that. Other basic reasons are, everyone gets married here compared to the West. And by everyone,
mm,
I mean majority. There's a pressure to get married. And
Mm.
then once you are married, there's a pressure to not get divorced. And now we're seeing that some of those things are changing,
Uh-huh.
but even then, it's very prevalent, which means that
Mm.
people are married and sometimes in marriages that are not making them happy
Mm.
or not emotionally or sexually fulfilling.
Mm.
And I say sexual because I've spoken to countless like women and even men who feel like they can't express sexual freedom in their bedroom with their
Mm.
spouse because they won't be respected. And so for all these reasons, digressing from the marriage, I think has just become one of the outlets that people seek.
Mm. Mm. Okay. And I'm imagining in the age of technology, that might be even somewhat more accessible than it was 20 years ago or 30 years ago, whereas the incidence of infidelity in relationships might have existed for, I'd like to say, for hundreds of years. Monogamy is a relatively new concept, but in the digital age, there's more of that access.
Oh, absolutely. So infidelity used to be around organic experiences,
Mm.
which, as we know, are just fewer and harder to come by. Whereas in the digital age, there's entire platforms
Mm.
dedicated to facilitating infidelity. Now,
Mm.
whether that's just chatting with someone, or whether that's actually going to meet someone, or whether that's actually just in the realm of various kinds of pornography, but
Mm.
it is really just a touch of a button away, and you can connect with someone if you so desire. So
Mm.
I think definitely that's probably increasing the rates of
Okay.
infidelity.
Okay. Jasmine, you're working with couples. How do you see the emotional impact of this?
So I think the emotional impact is huge, where it's one of those aspects or incidents that when we're met with in our marriage, it can become extremely crushing and threatening. And it can make us question the entire foundation of the marriage and whether this is going to work or not, or whether we want to stay in it or not. In a way, couples who face infidelity are at a crossroads, they're at a fork when they come.
Mm-hmm.
I think what it does to the aggrieved party is, self-doubt, low self-esteem,
Mm.
sometimes self-blame, initially self-blame, maybe I wasn't enough. And then trust is this precarious thing where we've kind of built trust over many, many millions of moments together. And then sometimes it can feel like all it takes is a shard of glass, like a momentary thing to just break it, which
Mm.
is how um, the aggrieved party feels when infidelity emerges. But I do think there is an entire other side to it, so it's a very, very painful process of how do for couples who decide that they want to work through it. And in my
Mhm.
experience, couples usually decide they want to work through it, even though we live in a very patriarchal system here where it's extremely shunned for women to commit
Mhm.
acts of infidelity. Almost all couples I've worked with where the woman has been the one to stray, they
Mm.
almost all of them choose to work through it even then. So I would
Mhm.
say most couples work. And for the person who's committed the offense, the cheater, for lack
Mm.
of a better word, I think it's an entire intense immersion into their own process. So
Mm.
what actually drove them to feel like they needed to do this? And it's far, far from just probably sex or fun or even what we might call love. It's usually a much deeper psychological wounding that they end up having to face. So they go into the deep end. And I think for the couple as a whole, as a system,
Mm.
um, they have to go through like this very painful experience of seeing their spouse for more than them just being their spouse. So to
Mm.
see my spouse as someone who could be attracted to someone,
Mhm.
um, myself as someone who could indulge in intimate activities with someone other than me. It's a very
Mm.
painful realization. But if we're able to rebuild trust and hold on to that realization, it's a whole new marriage where I'm like, okay, you're no longer just my partner. You're actually a whole person. So the
Mm-hmm.
way that I connect with you is just so much more intimate because I
Mm,
can hold space for all of these parts.
mm,
So, it really depends the direction in which the couple goes.
okay.
Um, but yeah, I think it can ultimately be. I just
Uh-huh.
quickly added,
Yep.
I had someone come in after working with me for a year on a, a case of infidelity.
Mm-hmm.
And they came in and they kind of were like, oh, by the way, this is the reunion of our infidelity. And I was like,
Mm,
oh, okay. Like, they're like, yeah, it's the anniversary. This is the month. And I'm like, right, you're right. This was the
mm,
month. And they're
mm,
like, we just want to celebrate. It's been the best thing that's happened to us. And that's not me in
mm,
any way endorsing infidelity, but that's um, that it just took their marriage to a whole other level.
mm. Absolutely. If you could just comment on how generally as a couples therapist, what are some of the interventions that you might have towards a couple that helps them heal through that space?
Right. So the first is investment, and often the aggrieved party is not fully invested at the time, which is normal. But it's primarily the person who strayed, their level of investment, their level of accountability.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a start point to explore as to it's a very telling point as to how psychologically sophisticated they might become in their process of figuring out what happened.
Mm,
So one intervention is how committed they are, how much accountability they take, and then rebuilding trust. So two things seem to happen at the same time. One
mm,
is rebuilding trust, which is done through honest communication, sometimes through creating transparency. And the other process is understanding why the affair happened.
mm-hmm.
And when both parties are able to have peace with understanding why it happened and know that there can be work that can put into why it happened without creating any kind of blame on the party that was aggrieved, um, then I think really in a nutshell, that's the simplest way I can put what happens in terms of the healing.
Okay. All right. And Jasmine, before we close for today, I know that in recent years you've been working with organizations, and that's very interesting and rich work that you're doing. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, so because of my kids and working from home, I wasn't doing organizational work, and part of me wasn't sure that I would enjoy it, and I didn't want to be um, what I might judge or label as a corporate sellout in my own head.
Mm,
But I played around with it. I got a great opportunity. I worked with running a group, which is something I've done in the past, and I felt
mm,
revived to run groups. I felt like things are changing, like the corporate world is more and more recognizing that they do not want to adhere to the structures of patriarchy and hierarchy, and they want more relational, introspective, compassionate leaders. And so when I started doing this work, I found that my heart was really into it, which
mm,
is why I continued with it. And one of my more recent passions with one of the projects I'm working on is around I'm not going to call it gender work, but it's like a gender neutralization project,
mhm,
which is us being able to shed what I carry, all the weight that I carry of the expectations of being a woman, and all the weight that you might carry of the expectations of being a man. And to
mm,
be more specific, in these corporate organizations, sometimes women feel that they need to be colonized into becoming men. Organizations are doing is they're promoting an extremely masculine way of being. And unfortunately, that's what's happening in the world, with like consumerism and commercialism and goals and targets. These are
mm,
all very masculine. That's a very masculine way of being. And
mm,
so, quick disclaimer, when I say masculine and feminine, I'm talking about energy. So I'm not
mm,
talking about gender roles. And we know that I need both. I need my masculine energy and I
mm,
need my feminine energy to have
mm,
balance. So what's happening in the world is that the world has kind of tilted towards a more masculine energy. And now we
mm,
see some progressive organizations focused at kind of bringing it back. And the feminine energy is really interesting because the masculine energy is straightforward. It's like um, grit, it's goal
mm,
oriented, it's going after things even when you're struggling. It's all those essential things that we do need. But the feminine energy is how to be introspective, how to
mm,
be intuitive, how to lead a team, how to read what your team members are bringing to the table or where they're struggling. Such essential parts of even just leadership, if we look at it in a corporate lens. So I've been really loving, the process of reconnecting people with lost parts of themselves.
That's really heartening to hear that organizations are bringing in a skilled professional to help people navigate that space. Jasmyn, it's been great having this chat with you. People have been very interested in some of the topics that you've touched upon, and I hope I can have another chat with you soon.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, Omar.
You're very welcome.